Okay, so we left off before the break talking about the Chicago School and really especially the sort of evolution of the high rise, a completely new building type that had never existed before. I mean, there were buildings like the Great Pyramids that were very tall, but they weren't buildings. They weren't really for people to occupy as space and to be used in particular ziggurats and so forth that we talk about in Mayan architecture and Mesopotamia and that sort of thing. It's the late 19th century, really starting in the 1890s, when the technologies all come together from the Industrial Revolution that allow people to build taller buildings. And we talked about the reasons for doing that, the expense of land in commercial districts, especially in a place like New York City, where they're limited to an island, or in Chicago, where the Chicago River and the lakefront kind of created a fairly tight area that we call the Loop. And of course, in more modern times, we are even building skyscrapers in places where there doesn't seem to be a limitation on land, but there's ego involved by the developers. There's a desire by businesses, especially bigger corporations, to have all of their employees in one place, in one building, and rather than spread out really wide, you can go up vertically. So all those were reasons to do it, but there's also the technological advances of the steel and iron framing that would then allow the facade to be hung off of that framing, what we call the curtain wall. And I'll talk a little more about that, especially with the Reliance building here in a moment. But also the advent of the elevator. You could only walk up reasonably, 5 or 6 stories at most before you huffing and puffing. So the elevator allows people to go 10 stories, 20 stories, 40 stories, 80 stories. You can go as high as you need to. The technologies of glass, of ventilation, allow this, and this will become even bigger in the 20th century as we continue to talk about the evolution of architecture and especially high rises in the 20th century. But in this early Chicago school, we see buildings with a lot of ventilation, a lot of natural light, because this is either right before the advent of electricity and the Edison light bulb, or just around the same time, like the Reliance building. And air conditioning is a 20th century innovation. So they didn't have anything, innovation. You had to open windows to get ventilation. So those are a lot of the different reasons why, and the technologies that allowed for the high rise. And Chicago was really the epicenter of this. I mean, New York City built a lot of skyscrapers, right? And very famous for many of them. But really, Chicago was where a lot of the innovations occurred that then, got used in New York City. And Reliance Building here is another really good example, really important one. It had 2 phases of construction. I'll explain that in a moment, with the first starting in 1891, and then the building was finished between 1894 and 95. Burnham and Root were the architects, and then in the later iteration, the successor firm, D.H. Burnham and Company, with Charles Atwood as the designer, finished it off. And again, I'll explain some of this here. There's a whole story behind this. And I worked on this building when it was being restored in the late 1990s. So this is kind of a special thing to talk about for me. So here it is, actually, after it was restored. This is really one of the great, this building epitomizes what a Chicago school skyscraper should be. It is taller than it is wide, and we've talked about some examples that don't feel that tall as compared proportionally to the base, but this is a fairly narrow footprint for this building. So it has the sense that it's a very tall building, even though now you can see in the photo, right, that it's surrounded by much taller buildings from the 20th century. But when this was built in the 1890s, this would have been one of the taller buildings in the city, not the tallest, but certainly one of the taller. And it was only like 14, 15 stories. It had a steel frame. It had terracotta cladding or curtain wall, and it had these large Chicago style windows. I'll talk more about Chicago windows here in a little bit. So the construction for this started in 1891. The developer bought this land, and there was an existing building that had been rebuilt, after the fire, and they hired Burnham and Root to build it. The story behind this is a photo of it as it appeared after the work was done in 1891. Because what happened was, you can see that it was a 4-story building. This was typical of the post-fire architecture in Chicago. And the developer, when they bought this building, there were tenants on these upper floors that had long-term leases, and that they couldn't be evicted. But the ground floor was open, and so the developer said, okay, I'm going to shore up the building, we'll excavate and put in the foundations for a skyscraper, and we'll rebuild the storefront, all while these tenants are still in the upper building. And so that's what got done in 1891. And I think this is really representative of the technological innovations and abilities, even in the 80s, to be able to do that. To basically put in the foundations for a skyscraper, all while keeping the building above it. This must have been something for people to see at that time, walking down the street and watching this. So the storefronts, this is not the greatest image. It's a really rough image that was a publicity photo at the time. But you can see the storefronts are really a lot of glass here, which is kind of what we would expect to see nowadays. But this would have been really dramatic and innovative to see almost an entire wall of glass, because glass technology was rapidly advancing, and getting the size of glass was getting bigger and bigger. Burnham and Root did this and constructed the building at the time. And here I'm showing you some modern photos of that storefront after it got restored in the late 90s. So here is the entrance to on the bottom left is the entrance to what would be the upper floors of the office building, but on the right shows you that storefront. There was some brown granite covering the piers, but basically it was almost all glass. And this was great. The Carson Peary Scott was the original tenant of this space. And we'll talk about Carson Peary Scott in a few minutes on another building. And they wanted lots of glass so that shoppers could look in their windows and see all the different items they had on display that you could buy in their department store. And so they loved the idea of having extensive glass. So something happened on January 15th, 1891. John Welburn Roop died. We talked about him a little bit last time. He was one of the most talented architects of the Chicago School in his partnership with Daniel Burnham. And they had been extremely busy. The World's Columbian Exposition, which we'll be talking about in a couple weeks, that had just been announced that Chicago would be the site, and Burnham and Root were the architects chosen to oversee the project, not necessarily design all the buildings. They brought in a lot of different architects, both from Chicago and out east, to each work on buildings, but they were overseeing it, and so they were extremely busy. And John Root was working long hours, traveling, and all of that, and really sort of working himself down. And on January 11th, they had a big meeting, a planning meeting, and Root had invited a lot of the architects that had been visiting Chicago to his house for a dinner party. And it was kind of a cold, wet night, and typical January, right? And he walked people to their carriages out front. This is his house. It still exists up on the Gold Coast, and his row house is this one here in the center. And so here's the front door, and he would walk his guests out, to the street where their carriage would pick them up. and sort of see them off, but he wasn't wearing his coat. And the next morning he woke up feeling quite ill, and 4 days later he was dead from pneumonia. And so this was one of the biggest losses in Chicago architecture and architecture in general. He died quite young, really at the peak of his talent and career. And it's, people have long speculated of what the future of architecture might have been had Root survived, because he was really the leader. Sullivan, as we'll be talking about, sort of became better known now as the father of the skyscraper, and this great designer, and he was, but really Root was even more famous and more talented than Sullivan was at this time when he died. So that left a hole. This is an image of Daniel Burnham there on the left, leaning on the drafting table. And one of those Eastern architects, McKim, Mead and White, said, "Hey, we got this really talented designer, draftsperson, Charles Atwood. Why doesn't he come work for you? We know there's a huge hole for you to fill here." And so they partnered up essentially. And Atwood was, in fact, a really incredible designer. He not only worked here on the Reliance building, but he did the Palace of the Fine Arts, which is now for the Columbian Exposition, which is now the Museum of Science and Industry. He worked on the Marshall Fields building. He worked on a few other prominent buildings in Chicago. But he was troubled. He basically had an opioid addiction, which was not uncommon at that time. And we think of various drug addictions as being something more contemporary, but it existed back then too. And he wound up really burning himself out, and by the late 1890s he had died from his addiction. So he had this brief little moment. I refer to him as like a shooting star, really bright in the sky, a lot of energy, but burns out really, really fast. So kind of another sad story, unfortunately. But he was the design, essentially the senior designer in Burnham's firm when the developer came back and said, "Hey, I cleared out my tenants on those upper floors. I'm ready to build the rest of the skyscraper." And so the upper part of the building was actually designed by Charles Atwood of D.H. Burnham and Company, and that was 84 to 95. And there's actually a series of photographs of the construction of this building, which I think are fantastic because it shows you what all of the things we had been talking about all coming together in this building. So I'll point out the date. Look at this, July 16th, 1894. We're seeing actually the bottom. This would be the second floor of the building. There's a scaffold that's kind of hiding the storefront below that. And here is the steel framing that's going up. And you can see it's already getting taller than those 4 or 5 story buildings, post-fire buildings. And then look at the photo from July 28th, just a couple of weeks later, and it's double the size. That's how fast these steel frame buildings could be built. All of these members were designed and then manufactured off-site. They could be delivered, in stages to the site, so that the workers constantly every day were putting these pieces together, and these things would go up really fast. It really blew the mind of people how quickly these buildings could be built. Here's August 1st. They're already starting to build out the cornice framing, and on November 8th, just a few months later, they've hung all the terracotta and they've, essentially put in the windows. I mean, the building isn't fully finished yet. They still have to do the interior build outs and so forth, but it's basically, in a matter of just a few months, this building is almost completely finished. We don't even build them that fast today. OSHA standards and, other issues, prevent buildings from being built that fast. But even the Economist newspaper in 1894 said no building in the city has ever been built so rapidly. It really blew people's mind that how fast this could be built. And developers love that. They wanted, time is money when you're a developer. You're paying taxes and money on the lot. The faster you can get tenants in the building, the faster you're getting income. And so, they want to see rapid construction. They love this. Here's a detail of the exterior cladding. Atwood kind of created a neo-Gothic style for this. You can see like the bundled columns here at the corner and these sort of rosettes that are similar to Gothic architecture. He was not averse to creating sort of revival styles of architecture on his buildings, unlike Burnham and later Sullivan, who eschewed the other older, applying other older architectural styles to these modern buildings. Here are some architectural drawing details of the steel framing. You can see these were all put together by rivet. And there were lots of components. Nowadays, the steel sections come in bigger pieces with fewer connections. But even with all of these connections and rivets, these things could still be built pretty fast. And then on the left side, you can see these two, that's the terracotta, and you can see it's only 10 inches thick, which today, by today's curtain wall standards, is pretty thick, but 10 inches is less than a foot. That's still pretty thin, and that includes like a solid masonry backup where you could put the plaster on the wall and so forth. So it really was a massive innovation in architecture and construction. This is a detail taken during the exterior restoration, and this is some of those steel buildings. The terracotta had been removed so it could be replaced or repaired before it was put back. And so you see the black here is the steel framing of the building. And then you see a little bit of that brick backup wall. This isn't structural at all. This brick is just here to provide a solid barrier behind the terracotta. And the terracotta is literally hung from the steel frame. There's little hooks that bolt into the steel, and they kind of hook into little holes in the terracotta. And it's hung. And that's part of the problem, is that over time, if that steel rusts and corrodes, it will break apart the terracotta, and the terracotta can fall off if you don't keep it repaired. And so it does take a lot of repairs and renovations that you see here in order to maintain these buildings 50 years later, 100 years later, or whatever. This is the floor plan of one of the office floors from the building, and you can see it was very compact. There was a bank of elevators up here that we see on the top. There was a staircase. Back then, one open staircase was all you needed. Nowadays, of course, fire codes make, multiple staircases. They have to be enclosed and all that. And then there was a central corridor. And there was even a light court here in the upper right, was a little window well where these offices back here could get some light and some ventilation. But most of the offices are around the perimeter. And even the interior offices usually had sort of shared windows and lights. And there's even windows that were on the office corridor so that light could filter down into the heart of the building. This is a photo taken after the renovations were done. It was converted from an office building into a hotel. So the windows that used to provide light into the corridor have been painted and sort of on the backside, covered with drywall, so that if you're in your hotel room, you don't have people in the corridor looking in on you. But this was all intact. This marble and mahogany wood doors and frames and stuff was virtually intact on many of the upper floors here. So if you rent a room at I think it's called the Pineapple Hotel now, you can walk in here and you can see what an office building from the 1890s would have looked like in Chicago. And this is that open stair that we were allowed to leave because we put a fire curtain around it. It's basically fire sprinklers that would sort of create a water barrier. There's new staircases built in that are enclosed that provide emergency egress as well. This is the main lobby. So you would walk in if you were visiting a tenant on the upper floors. On the left is the historic view. On the right is the view after it was reconstructed. And it's all reconstructed. All of this was missing when we worked on it. This was the part of the project that I really was focused on. But you see that there were these iron cages, wrought iron cages that provided the barrier to the elevators. You know, back then the elevators were just open to let in light and ventilation, and there would have been an elevator operator actually that would have taken you. You would have gotten in, said, "Hey, I'm going to the fourth floor to my dentist or whatever." This was a professional office building, but the rest of the lobby was filled with marble and just rich materials. And it was also a building in which there was both electric lighting and gas lighting. Back in the late 19th century, a lot of buildings had natural gas lighting, and you would turn on the gas, light a match, and get a flame going, and that's how buildings were illuminated for several decades, up until the invention by Edison of the electrolier, as they called it, with a Edison light bulb. And you can kind of see that a little bit. Right in the middle here is reproductions of the fixtures that were in here. And the vertical one was the natural gas light, so the flame would go up, and the bottom ones were electric lighting. And the idea was, they didn't know in 1890s, they didn't know was the future going to be this newfangled electrolier by Edison, or would we stick with natural gas? And so they split the difference here in the Reliance building and had fixtures with both. Obviously, the electrolier won out, and everybody has electric light bulbs now. But this was a cool building because they were sort of splitting the difference there. And last is a historic view. This is the cage of the elevator. Obviously, it's just sitting on a floor, but this was the elevator cage that was used in the Reliance building. And you can see they often, people call it cages or bird cage elevators because that's what they looked like to people. And you would walk in, right? There was an entrance and an exit. So when it got to your floor, the gates would open and people would walk out on the one side, and you could walk in on the other side. It was supposed to be very efficient. And there would have been an operator, and you would have told them what floor to go to, and they'd take you to that floor. And you had to keep your fingers inside the cage, because as the elevator went up and down, if you stuck your hand or your fingers through, you would lose a hand or finger. And so you had to be very careful if you had children with you and that sort of thing. So nowadays, all these things are enclosed, both for fire reasons and for safety and all that. It's very, very rare to ride in an open cage elevator. There's a handful left in Chicago, and I'm not even sure they'll survive the pandemic, because these buildings have been shut down, the elevator operators have been let go, and all that. So we'll see what happens after the pandemic ends. All right, so I want to finish by talking a little bit about, we've talked about, okay, we have the technologies for these buildings, we have the reasons for these high rises, but architecturally, what should the tall building be? And the last examples I'm going to talk about are the answers to that, at least the answers in Chicago for that. The photo I'm showing you is from New York City. Like I said, New York is famous. It had plenty of tall buildings as well that were being built in this time frame and in the early 20th century. But New York architects tended, as this quote says, to try to apply popular architectural styles of Europe and of the past to this new technology. And I like this photo because I think these two buildings on the left here, this one here and this one, show you that doesn't work. I mean, to put a Renaissance dome and pediment on a skyscraper makes it look stupid, if you want to be truly honest. I mean, this might work for a cathedral, it might work for a Capitol building or church, but to put it on a skyscraper just doesn't fit. The one in the middle here, has just stacked floor after floor, and then this really tall sloped roof with dormers. Again, a little odd looking, and then this little, clock tower sticking out of it. Just from a standpoint of, is this what a high-rise should be? And the answer by Chicago architects was, no way. This just doesn't work. A tall building should reflect the fact that it's a tall building. And the person who really gets a lot of credit for this idea is Louis Sullivan. And he wrote an article in 1896 called "The Tall Building Artistically Considered," and a couple of very, very important themes come out of this. The first is this theme of ornamentation and originality. Um, it's the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, of all things physical, metaphysical, so on and so on. Get to the bottom. That form ever follows function. This is the law. Sullivan saw nature especially as an inspiration, and he looked at nature and he said, "My God, a tree is a natural thing, and it can be very tall, and you'll notice that it has balance. It reflects with with the branches coming out or something, or a plant or a flower growing up. It reflects the functionality of it. The form it has reflects that functionality." And he really thought that architecture, especially high-rise architecture, ought to reflect the function, the fact that it is tall. And so sometimes this quote gets sort of shortened up to "form follows function," but the real quote is "form ever follows function." And the idea that the building, every aspect of the design of the building, ought to reflect the fact that of its functionality, of its tallness, of its framing, of its structure. A tree reveals its structure. A high-rise building should reveal its structure. So I'm going to show you a few examples of how Sullivan applies with that. And to me, one of the best ones is the Wainwright building. Ironically, this was built in St. Louis, not in Chicago, but it's considered part of the Chicago School, of course, because it comes out of the firm Adler and Sullivan, based in Chicago, from 1891. And same year, really, that Reliance Building is the construction of that is being done. So it's a good comparison against the sort of neo-Gothic architecture that Atwood does for the design of the Reliance Building, something very different the way Sullivan approaches this. So again, we're not talking about a super tall building here, but this would have been taller than any building was being built, in St. Louis at the time frame. And really, most scholars think this is one of the truest expressions of a high-rise building of this era. In many ways, it has a Renaissance philosophy to it. If we go way back to the beginning of the semester and you're thinking Renaissance, it has a solid base to it, it has a central part, and it has this projecting cornice. But Sullivan doesn't turn this into a Renaissance palazzo like we saw with the Medici or something, or the Palazzo Farnese. He uses the concept of organizing a building that is very Renaissance, but the building itself, especially the central part, is expressing its verticality. Look at the piers that extend up. They are purely vertical. They are uninterrupted. They rise from the base here of the building up to the cornice of the building. And even the spandrel panels between the windows are recessed a little bit so that that verticality is emphasized. And that is what Sullivan really believes in a tall building should be. And we see again from that same article he wrote, "Tall Building Artistically Considered," what is the chief characteristic of the tall office building? And at once we answer, it's lofty. And the loftiness is to the artistic nature is thrilling, right? He's saying it should express that. If we're building a tall building, let's make it a tall building. Let's make it look like a tall building. If we look in the middle here, to excite the imagination, it must be tall, every inch of it tall. Use all the force and power, to make it tall. And that's what he embraces here at the Wainwright building. This is a more modern view of it. It's been renovated, and the light court you can just see on the right side. The light court was infilled to make more space, interior, and so forth. But we can really see that this is expressing that verticality. It has a solid base to it, and it has this sharp cornice line. But everything in between is this uninterrupted verticality of these piers here, and that's what Sullivan wanted to emphasize. Here's a floor plan, and in the floor plan we can see the same concept we talked about, the idea that all the offices have light and ventilation because they need to open windows, they need natural light to come in because they don't have good electricity yet. And so it's a U-shaped building with the elevators, at the central part here to create kind of a core for that. And here's just a few details. This is a detail of the cornice line in this organic ornament. Sullivan believed in using nature as the inspiration to ornament buildings. And so he used a more organic, natural inspired ornamentation rather than, neo-Gothic or neo-Renaissance or something like that. And so Sullivan is considered to be one of the first American architects to have a truly American architecture, something that was not borrowed from European architecture that we have been talking about all semester. Here's another good detail of, at the very top of the cornice. So the capital, is not a Doric or Ionic order or something like that. It's just a purely organically inspired, unique 19th century American innovation. All right, so there are other architects with similar ideas. The Marquette building in Chicago from 1895 by Welburn and Roche is another firm doing tall Chicago school buildings. Marquette is one of their great, one of their best buildings that still exists, thankfully. And it's one of the first buildings to use what becomes known as the Chicago window. We saw it a little bit with the Reliance building, and we see it nicely here on the Marquette building. And a Chicago window is a window that has, it's a big bay with a big center fixed window and flanking smaller flanking windows that are typically double hung, and they can be operated. So, and I'll show you a close-up example in a minute, but you can see, it's a big area of window, right? You don't need a lot of masonry that we saw at the Monadnock building. That was a solid masonry building. And so you just need a little bit of masonry covering the steel structure. The rest of it can be windows. Really big innovation here. And you want a lot of light, so because of the lack of electricity. So you've got a big window in the center, and then you also need ventilation, so you can have shorter little windows on the sides that are double hung. You can open up the window to get some ventilation in as well. Here is a modern view of the building. It's also been restored. I actually worked on the project to put the cornice back on up here at the very top. But it's a nice brown brick and terracotta building, and you can see that it is true to its form, reflects the function, just as Sullivan talked about. It looks like a steel frame. It looks like a grid of building, and it could be built as tall as you wanted to and as wide as you wanted to, sticking with that grid, and you just have a cornice at the top and you have a base at the bottom. Again, similar to what we saw with the Reliance build. Is terracotta baked in a kiln in order? Yes. So terracotta is like brick. It's just a different kind of form to it. It's fired in a kiln, and it can be molded into shapes, and it's usually bigger. A brick is only so big. It's a small piece. Terracotta is generally a much bigger piece. It can be a couple of feet square at least, but it's usually hollow in the back. And yeah, it's not like cement. It's like it's a masonry, and so it's hollow in behind it, so that it's not so heavy. It's still quite heavy, and then it has little holes in the webbing of it in behind that it can be hung from the steel structure. Unlike brick, which is stacked, it has to be stacked on top of each other. Terracotta it can be hung from the building. It doesn't have to be stacked up like bricks are. So here again, you can see how the windows are really taking and becoming the vast majority of the facade of this building. And here's a nice detailed view of the Chicago window. Now, this one's a little different. It has, and it always did, it had a center mullion, and that just allows them, it's a little easier and cheaper to put two pieces of glass in here instead of one big piece of glass. Actually, if you look on the very bottom, you can see that was one big piece of glass. So it's still a Chicago window. Typically, it would have one piece of glass with the flanking windows, but at Marquette, there were actually two pieces in the center. Same thing, it still works. But you see on the flanking on the ends are these double hung windows. They're much smaller windows, a lot easier to open a double hung window that's only a few feet wide. To try to open something here, the wider one in the middle just wouldn't work so well. So that's a Chicago window, and this was an innovation from the Chicago architects. It gets used all across the country in these new high-rise buildings and so forth, but because it came out of Chicago, it's known as a Chicago window, just like we talked about Palladian windows back in the first part of the semester. All right, another great example, going back to Louis Sullivan, is the Schlesinger and Mayer department store, also better known as the Carson Perry Scott building, which no longer is there. Now it's known as Sullivan Center. This was built between 1899 and 1904, just by Louis Sullivan. In the recession of 1893, really hit architecture firms really hard, and so Sullivan and Adler kind of split up their firm. Adler eventually died just a few years later, and so Sullivan went out on his own, and this was probably his best known commission independently, starting in 1899. And here is a view of the building as it looks today. I also worked on this building, restoring the terracotta, and was involved early on in the recreation of the cornice on this building. This is because it's a department store, it's sort of spread out with additions. It doesn't look as tall as it is wide, but it still has the fundamentals of the high rise to it. In the earlier stages, it was a little taller than it was wide, and then there were later additions that you see over here on the far right that make it look wider now than it was tall. But the same principle is the Chicago School building. It has a grid system of the framing that, steel framing that it was used to build it. It has, just like Sullivan talked about and used at the Wainwright building, it has a base to it. Then it has the sort of central shaft, and then it has a cornice to cap it off. Very, very much like a Renaissance, planning structure, but it's not a Renaissance palazzo at all. And I do love the corner rotunda, really emphasizes the verticality to it, actually. I'll show you a photo of that in a minute. Here are some historic photos also showing the construction of it, and you can see the steel framing grid that then is covered with the terracotta, which is both an aesthetic approach, but it's also a fireproofing thing. The lesson from the Chicago fire was that steel and iron melted when it got really hot, and so the terracotta and the brick masonry surrounding the steel framing was as much of a fireproofing method as it was aesthetic. Later, we're going to see in the 20th century, in the second Chicago school, that you can get rid of the fireproof, you can fireproof in other ways, and we can express the steel structure completely, and Mies van der Rohe would start to do that. But here we're still in a technology where we're using masonry to do that. Here's a nearly complete, and then this is the building as it was completed in 1904 on the left, or on the right, excuse me, by Sullivan. And so you can see it's not a super tall building, proportionally. Even the building next to it from the same era is taller, but it's still using the technologies of the high rise and the Chicago school that Sullivan and Root and Hullabert and Roche had all developed in the 1890s. Here's another view as it's being expanded here. Again, the framing and then the cladding. And this is all showing you that principle of form ever follows function. The framing is the form, is the functionality of it, is the structure, is the bays of a department store. And then the terracotta cladding on the exterior is the form, and it's following that. It's not trying to pretend that it's anything different. And a lot of architects in the East said, these are ugly buildings. These are ordinary. They're plain. There's no style to them. You know, those Chicago architects, they're not making architecture. They're just making factories. So this was not widely embraced by everybody in the country, but it was really popular in Chicago, and a lot of developers increasingly said, hey, I don't want to pay for all that fancy design and architecture. Just give me a building that I can put into use and I can start charging rent to right away. And they became more and more as the 20th century went on, developers who are the ones paying for these buildings said, I just want these Chicago-like buildings, you know, because it's cheap and it's easy, and that's what I want. Here's a view of that corner rotunda that really emphasizes the verticality. It's one of my favorite views to see that. And of course, the storefronts, as we see in this view, are just incredible. This is actually cast iron painted to look like bronze. You know, there's no way the department store could afford to actually do all of this in bronze. So they just used cast iron and painted it. And when it was restored in the 2000s, we took all this cast iron off. We stripped it of all its paint, all of its corrosion, rehung it with good anchoring, and then it was all repainted to look like the bronze using the original paint scheme. And it's really a masterpiece of ornamentation. This is very much Art Nouveau architecture. We'll talk about the Art Nouveau in a couple of weeks. But this is the Art Nouveau really originates in Chicago. There's good scholarship now to suggest that the Art Nouveau movement, which was most common in Europe, really originated in Chicago by Sullivan at some of these buildings and was adapted and adopted by European architects. So one of the first instances of, instead of Americans borrowing from Europe, Europeans borrowing from Americans and especially Chicagoans. And these are just a couple of things. Sullivan in 1922 wrote another book, A System of Architectural Ornament, that talks about this, you know, inspiration from nature and how ornament ought to be inspired by nature, not by, you know, Greek revival and so forth. It wasn't very influential by this time. You know, other architecture was being eclipsed here, and Sullivan was really, unfortunately, had sort of fallen out of favor and died in the 1920s, sort of penniless, unfortunately. Here's another print from that book from 1922. And then you can compare that to the actual details on the Sullivan Center. Carson Perry Scott, just a little quick aside, Schlesinger and Mayer built the store. They were a big department store in Chicago. It pretty much bankrupted them building this department store, ironically. And so soon after the building was complete, they went out of business. And Carson Perry Scott, who had been in the Reliance building just a block down the street, they were expanding, and they said, "Hey, we'll take over." So they took over the building very early on in about 1905, and were there until the early 2000s. And so, you know, most people know this building as the Carson Perry Scott building, or Carson's, and, you know, longtime Chicagoans, of course, know, you know, Carson Perry Scott, of course, and then they left the building, so now it's Target, you know, and just known as Sullivan Center, but it was really Schlesinger and Mayer that built it. Now, if I'm asking you on a quiz and you got to write it down, if you say Carson Perry Scott, I'll give you credit because, you know, that it's most people know it commonly as that. So at least you'll know the building, you know, and that, but the real name was Schlesinger and Mayer. They were the client that hired Sullivan to do this, and they ought to get credit in many ways. Another great project of his from the same time frame was the Gage building on Michigan Avenue. This is from 1898. Hollerman and Roche was the architect, actually, but they hired Sullivan to do the facade. The architect in the firm said, you know, let's have this master, Louis Sullivan, let's have him design the facade. So it was kind of an interesting partnership here between Holabird and Roche, who are very accomplished architects. I mean, there was no reason they couldn't design the facade of this building, but they really liked the message and the literature that Sullivan had been putting out, and so they actually brought him on the team and said, we want you to design the facade of this building. And it's one of Sullivan's last high-rise building commissions before um, he had a drinking problem as well. Actually, speaking of addictions, and probably affected his work and his relationship with clients after 1900. And so really after the early 1900s, about 1904, 1905, he had very few commissions after that, a few nice banks scattered throughout the North Midwest. But these big, high rises and department stores, all of that dried up for him, sadly. But this is a great one to show because it really epitomizes his philosophy of a soaring, tall building that where the form follows the function. So again, we see a much taller building than it is wide, so it looks like a soaring high rise. It really reflects the grid, the framing, and then the fact that you just clad the piers in terracotta and a little bit of cladding between the floors, the spandrels between the floors. The rest of it is windows, and that everything emphasizes the verticality of it. These two center piers are uninterrupted from the storefront all the way up to this flourishing ornamental, filigree here of a capitol. The rest of it is rather plain and emphasizes the verticality of the building. Here's a great detail of the organic or natural nature-inspired capitals. Again, we're not seeing a Greek or Roman order on this building at the top of the columns. That would look silly. The proportions were all wrong. So he just has it, blossoming into a cornucopia of flowers and leaves. It's really fantastic. Here's a nice historic view of it. The storefronts down at the bottom were similar to those at the Schlesinger and Mayer building. Here's a historic photo on the right. Unfortunately, those were lost over time. There's still a few panels. Some are in the Art Institute in the main hall there where all the other architectural ornaments are. There's also some panels down in the architecture building at the University of Illinois in Champaign. But unfortunately, sadly, this was never recreated because it was also just like Sullivan, or just like the Sullivan Center, Schlesinger and Mayer building. It was this incredible ornamental cast iron painted green to look like bronze. All right, so that kind of finishes off our discussion of the Chicago School. I'm not going to take the time on the blackboard in the links with the videos is this kind of a cool, fun little silent video from 1914 of a dirigible, a hot air balloon flying around the city, and taken from it, you can see aerial views of some of the first aerial views of Chicago. And about the 3-minute mark, they pass over the loop, and you can see some of these early Chicago school buildings from the late 19th, early 20th century. But there's also views of the lakefront and the University of Chicago and Jackson Park and stuff. So on your own time, take a few minutes to enjoy those aerial views of the city as it looked, by 1914 with these Chicago school buildings. All right. That will end the Chicago